How is it going, everybody? So, what I have here is an original Game Boy Advance where it has a mirror clear shell on it, turquoise blue buttons and silicone pads. Both the shell and buttons are made by FunnyPlaying. A new glass lens with the holographic Game Boy Advance logo. A brand new clear speaker made by FunnyPlaying. Helder GameTech's audio amplifier, power cleaner, and new capacitors, clicky LNR buttons, a rechargeable battery made by FunnyPlaying, and also an IPS LCD with the OSD menu display included. So, yeah, it's amazing right here, but there's something else I would like to also mention, and that is, while the USB-C hole is right there, this indicates that this Game Boy Advance has a dockable mod, which means you can connect this Game Boy Advance to a dock and use an external controller to play it, and also use an HDMI out to play it on the TV as well. So what I have on this Game Boy Advance right now is the Easy Flash cartridge, and I am going to go to AGB checker cartridge here, which would also be known as the Game Boy Advance aging cartridge. And what I'm about to do here is go to the option program, key input test, and as you can see, the B and A buttons work, D-pad works too, start and select also work, and even the LNR buttons work. So this Game Boy Advance has all working buttons. I am going to go over the features of the IPS LCD OSD menu. So here's two touch sensors right here. This touch sensor changes the color filters on the screen, which we have normal, black and white, cyan, magenta, yellow, green, red, and blue. And the other touch sensor changes the style of the screen with the pixels. So there's normal, vertical, and horizontal mixed together, which makes the pixel grid look very similar to retro kind of LCDs such as the Game Boy Advance SP AGS 101 or the Nintendo DS Lite with a nice proper backlit screen. The other option for the pixel grid is just vertical lines going down without any horizontal lines overlapping the screen. And the one final option is the horizontal lines version of the pixels with grid without the vertical lines in the way. And now I set the screen back to normal. As you can see, there are not any pixel grids on the screen. So if I were to hold two touch sensors together, then the LCD provides a factory reset. And now let me go over the button controls with the OSD menu. So to open the OSD menu, hold L and R, and then press select together, and then you get the OSD menu here. For the brightness function, there are 15 levels of brightness on the screen. For the color modes, which is color filters, we have 8 different kinds of color filters included. Now the pixel effects, we have 4 kinds of display variations with the pixel effects. The frame thing is something that you can either turn on or off, and on and off for the frame. Here's the touch sensors function if you want to turn them on or off, and I shut it off, the touch function. And here's the factory reset, which resets everything on the display. So let me go over what the touch sensor off means. When you try using the touch sensor to control the color filters or the pixel grid on the LCD when the touch sensors are off, it doesn't do anything. But then, if I was to turn the touch sensors on, then the touch sensors have functionality. Hold on, let me just remove this OSD menu here. Now let me tell you something about the touch functions. They work properly again. So when the touch sensors are off, they don't do anything, but when they're on, you can use them as pixel effects or color filter options. Now let me show you what I mean by dockable. And I have this dock right here, which is made to connect the Game Boy Advance onto this stand right here. And what I'm about to do is put this Game Boy Advance onto the standable dock. And as you can see, it has a USB-C right there. And if I hook it into there, because I have a rechargeable battery mod installed, I see a blue light on the battery pack, which I can see it from the back. But yeah, this is the FunnyPlaying rechargeable battery pack. Blue light on that battery pack means it's charging. So when I turn it on, the Game Boy Advance runs fine. But now let me show you what I mean by the external controller. For example, I'm using a Super Nintendo controller, and here's a Super Nintendo controller plug or port that I can plug it into it, and I have this controller's end right here, and I plugged it into this dockable stand. And now I'm using a Super Nintendo controller, and as you can see, this Game Boy Advance works with the Super Nintendo controller. And I'm using the Retro 6 Super Gamepad, which is intended for the Super Nintendo console. And as you can see, the Game Boy Advance is working fine right now, and I'm gonna be playing Super Mario Advance 4 on there. And yeah, you can hear that the speaker is very loud because I'm using Helder Game Tech's audio amplifier, so that louder sound can be produced with the Game Boy Advance console. Alright, so here I have my laptop with OBS Studio operating on there. And while I have this Game Boy Advance right here, I'll be putting Metroid Zero Mission into this bad boy here. Turn it on. Hook it up to this dock right here. And ta-da! The Game Boy Advance is now running through the monitor. This is because I have a micro HDMI connector connected to right here so that it can output on a monitor. And now let me switch my camera to the screen of the OBS Studio, which I should technically say switch to the capture of this right here. Alright, so here's Metroid Zero Mission on a Game Boy Advance screen, which I'm talking about the dockable mod, and that I have this Game Boy Advance hooked up to a screen monitor, in this case a PC, and here's the intro sequence for Metroid Zero Mission. And when I say Game Boy Advance with an HDMI out, I have the Game Boy Advance hooked onto the dock, and the dock has an HDMI connector, specifically a mini HDMI connector. And I have the mini HDMI connector connected to an HDMI and then to a monitor screen. And as you can see, the Game Boy Advance games, such as Metroid Zero Mission right here, works perfectly fine on this beautiful screen like this with a monitor screen, such as a TV, or in this case a PC with OBS Studio. Alright, now here's some gameplay footage of Metroid Zero Mission with the Game Boy Advance HDMI mod, and I'm specifically talking about the dock mod for the Game Boy Advance. And I have this Game Boy Advance connected to a dock and then to an HDMI, so I can clearly see the nice picture of Game Boy Advance games with a TV screen or a PC monitor or anything. I got the Morph Ball. Double tap down on the D-pad to take ball form and gain access to narrow passageways. find this Game Boy Advance dock mod to be cool because while the Game Boy Advance can be played with an external controller such as the Nintendo controller, it can also be displayed on a television screen or a PC screen, or specifically I should say any kind of monitor. I have Super Mario Land on the Game Boy Advance. I'm going to be doing a little bit of a gameplay with Super Mario Land on the Game Boy Advance modified with a dock plus HDMI out mod. And as you can see, I have the color palette set to full black and white so that we see true Game Boy original experience with that black and white appearance. And the original Game Boy had like a pea green colored screen. So, yeah. Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, and Game Boy Advance SP consoles can use Game Boy original cartridges, and you can use the included color palettes by using the D-pad, including and also the A and B buttons too. Right before the game starts at the Game Boy Color boot-up screen. Overall, I find the Game Boy Advance dock with HDMI out mod to be very nice because while you can use the Game Boy Advance with an external controller such as the Super Nintendo or NES controllers, you can also use Game Boy Advance games on the big screen, such as, like, I'm talking about the TV or any kind of monitor, such as a PC screen. And speaking of which, with the clear and this clear shell and turquoise blue buttons, this Game Boy Advance has an appearance similar to the E3 2000 Space World prototype console. And also I have a Game Boy Advance console in silver, which this Game Boy Advance right here is an OEM silver shell, and I replaced the buttons on this GBA right there with Extreme Rates orange colored buttons. And this also gives out a Space World 2000 E3 2000 prototype Game Boy Advance style. I have both Game Boy Advances right here, and they look like they're from prototypes with the Space World 2000s. But they're just aftermarket parts usage, specifically for the buttons and the shell right there. When it comes to the L and R buttons on this Game Boy Advance, I replaced the tactile switches on the motherboard with more clicky ones. Do you hear that? The L and R buttons are clicky. Compare that with this stock styled L&R tactile switches. We don't hear the click with these original tactile switches as much as this one right here, which I replaced both of the L&R tactile buttons on the motherboard with more clicky ones. And also, I replaced the power LED status, the original one in chartreuse specifically, with this brighter green one right here. And as you can see, this green LED power status is brighter than the original chartreuse power status LED. For comparison, I have this Game Boy Advance right here. Although this Game Boy Advance is currently running on low battery, which means the batteries are about to die on this one here. This stock Game Boy Advance Power Status LED is more of a chartreuse color, and it's more dimmer compared to this one. That's about it for this video. So if you like this video, why don't you give it a thumbs up, and make sure you subscribe to this channel for future content on YouTube. And as always, thank you for watching, and have a nice day.